When it comes to dedicated puzzle games, it's unsurprising that narratives usually take a backseat to the brain-bending challenges, but Maquette is a little bit different. Though it does feature a fascinating gimmick that facilitates some clever problem-solving, its engaging puzzles are accompanied by a genuinely affecting story that recounts the life cycle of a relationship, and surprisingly, this aspect might be what I end up remembering the game for. Initially, however, the element that drew my interest was this game's core puzzle mechanics. Maquette is a recursive puzzle game set in a world nested within itself, where the game's signature feature is a scale model of your surroundings that can be manipulated to affect the environment around you. If you see something blocking your way in the level, you can find the object in the scale model and simply pick it up, removing it from the normal-sized world. Conversely, you can drop items into the model to manifest them at a larger scale, or drop them on the floor in the medium-sized world to create a smaller scale version of them within the model. Almost every puzzle in the game revolves around the interaction between the mini-level and the player-sized level in some form or fashion, but to the game's credit, this is a surprisingly versatile mechanic. You can make items small enough so they can fit through gaps, or big enough so that they become part of the environment like a bridge or a staircase. Alternatively, some puzzles might involve interacting with an inaccessible area of the player-sized world via the scale model itself. Once things do start to feel a little bit formulaic, Maquette adds another layer to the scale-bending puzzle solving by allowing you to leave the player-sized world and enter a giant version of the level. It isn't a massive shift in gameplay, but moving items between the three scales of world opens up some surprising possibilities. For instance, certain key items may be used in a completely different way when viewed at a larger scale, such as the banister of a gigantic ramp becoming more useful as its own smaller, elevated ramp. In short, I think Maquette's worlds within worlds approach to puzzle design is unique and super interesting, but there are some elements of it that I don't love. While the game never loses the size-shifting gimmick in its entirety, the scale model itself loses the game's focus in its final act, which is strange considering that the game is literally named after it, maquette being the French word for a sculptor's scale model. Additionally, it doesn't feel like the mechanic is explored quite as fully as it could be, as it only dips its toes into some seriously creative uses of its mechanic's scale and space-bending potential in its final act, and not for very long. Also, while the core mechanic is delightfully unique and kept me engaged for most of the game, most of its puzzles really did boil down to the same solution, albeit rearranged slightly. You're almost always scaling objects up or down, and because you're limited by what key items are available during each puzzle, there are really only so many things you can try for any given challenge. Instead of being asked to apply the scale model mechanics in fresh ways, most of the game's difficulty stemmed from finding the perfect spot for a newly scaled item to work as intended. Alongside this rather cursory exploration of its genuinely interesting core concepts, Maquette just isn't a very long game. Depending on how well you take to its world-reshaping ideas, the game offers between 3 and 5 hours of play on average, which is bound to leave some players wanting more, especially when it feels like there's so much more ground to be covered with its main gameplay feature. On the other hand, Maquette at least doesn't feel like it's wasting your time, and when you consider its narrative components, it makes for a pretty good single-sitting game for a quiet evening in. While the thing that drew me to Maquette was its unique take on puzzles, the element of it that I'm likely to remember most fondly is its story. Framed as a letter, the game recounts the relationship between two people named Michael and Kenzie, beginning with their awkward initial meeting in a coffee shop and ending with their eventual falling out. The game starts with this infectious innocence and joy, but slowly descends into a more somber tone as Kenzie and Michael begin to hit rough patches, and seemingly small issues begin to grow bigger and make more of an impact on their relationship, which is appropriately reflected in the scale shenanigans used to complete the game's puzzles. It's a surprisingly affecting plot, despite its somewhat cliched opening act, and I found myself genuinely hooked by the snippets of memories that Maquette uses to exemplify the characters' relationship with one another. They feel super relatable, as well as charmingly awkward, and while a lot of this is achieved by the game's often whimsical writing, its solid voice acting definitely helps the story hit the tone that it's going for. It's quite pleasant, but with an ever-increasing tension just beneath the surface. I also really enjoyed the game's use of sketchbook illustrations and scribbled writing within the world to tell the story. Not only does it evoke the couple's shared sketchbook that played a pivotal role in their initial meeting, it also reinforces the framing device of Michael's letter in a simple yet stylish manner. In fact, I think that describes the game's visuals pretty well in general. Simple, but stylish. There isn't anything here visually that will blow your mind, but the imaginative structures and environments found within Maquette are vibrant and colourful during the early stages and become much more dark and less fantastical once the characters' relationship is on the rocks. In addition to capturing the mood between the two characters during each stage of the story, each level repurposes elements of the memories shared by them to produce a dreamlike setting that's constantly surprising. These visuals are typically accompanied by the ambience of the environments found within the nested worlds, ranging from the muffled music of a house party to the lonely wind that blows through a rundown neighborhood. The game's understated audio combines with the visuals in a way that creates a really calming atmosphere to experience, even when things start to fall apart. That relative silence is broken during moments of importance within the story when Maquette utilizes vocal tracks to punctuate the changes or growth of the characters to great effect. It's at this point that I honestly run out of things to say about Maquette. Like most puzzle games with such a strong core gimmick, I risk spoiling some of its most interesting puzzles by elaborating on it further, and at the end of the day, it just isn't a very long game. This is especially true if you aren't one for trophy hunting, as there isn't a ton of optional content to sink your teeth into. However, I could certainly think of worse ways to spend a quiet night in. And with all that said, Maquette is good. With a strong core concept and some interesting scale-bending puzzles to solve, Maquette brushes up against those great aha moments on multiple occasions, but doesn't quite deliver them consistently. But even so, I was constantly finding myself impressed by the cleverness of its main gameplay mechanic, and the emotional, relatable story it was telling helped to soften any disappointment that might come from the game's lackluster runtime or concepts that might not have been fully explored. If you're into neat puzzle mechanics and smaller scale, more personal stories, then I definitely recommend checking Maquette out. Maquette is available on PS4, PS5, and PC.